Here's our last formal lecture topic on design. So in this section, we're not really talking about design in terms of line, shape, color, texture for making aesthetic artworks. We're really talking more about how those concepts are applied, things that we use in our everyday lives, how we are designing industrially made objects, furniture, dishes, silverware, cars, computers, all of those types of things. So again, we want to emphasize the idea of things that are purely aesthetic, like paintings or sculptures, versus things that do have some form of use, that they are tools or objects we use for a utilitarian purpose. So we have the difference between aesthetic and utilitarian objects. We also want to think a little bit about the of price points. If you consider a variety of stores, just trying to think of clothing brands. If you look at, for example, Old Navy versus the Gap, similar kind of style, and even I suppose the same company really, but a lower price point at Old Navy than the same type of garment that could be purchased from the Gap, right? So with the advent of the modern production of objects for sale and use for home and lifestyle, we also have this concept of needing to have a variety of price points. Inexpensive, everyday use objects versus luxury items that are very expensive. I definitely want you to be aware of some major from the late 1800s till today. So the ones really to pay the closest attention to and try to associate the designer name with the movement would be the arts and crafts movement, led by William Morris. The Art Nouveau movement, really the designer that you'll most likely recognize would be L.C. Tiffany. The Art Deco movement, I want you to recognize the work of Paul Frankel. The De Stijl movement, Gerrit Rietveld. Bauhaus will concentrate on the furniture design of Marcel Breuer. Then we'll look at some major trends where you don't necessarily have to know the names of individuals, but we have the advent of streamlining in the 1930s, followed by the introduction of organic forms in design and architecture in the 40s and 50s, the Scandinavian design influence from the 30s to the 70s. You could kind of think of that as the IKEA style. And then really from the 60s till now is this multiple approach to style, the postmodern. Basically anything goes, and mixing and matching is the order of the day. So we've looked at the idea of things filling just practical function, utilitarian use, and would be the objects on this slide. They're not ugly, they're not bad, they're nice, but they're simple and basic. They're inexpensive relative to the same company's work that is at a higher price point and is not meant really for daily use. In fact, some of these might not ever be used for practical function, might only be shown for display. These are pure aesthetic objects that still have a utilitarian form or shape. We definitely have looked at innovations in architecture and in other aspects of life, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, roughly around the at the Crystal Palace, as it was known, designed by Joseph Paxton. It's basically an enormous greenhouse that was built very, very quickly thanks to prefabricated, pre-made pieces that could be connected together very quickly and built on site. So the objects were made in a factory, shipped to the site, and constructed very quickly. That is at the heart and soul of the Industrial Revolution, making things quick, cheap, from a factory point of view, like making the same thing, multiple units of the same thing. And you can see how some people really enjoyed that, but how other people might feel threatened by it, that it is cold, it's mechanical, it doesn't involve human beings. So there's a reaction against this kind of approach, and that brings us here. Doesn't this look like it came from an earlier time period? But in fact, these are from the 1860s. This is 1850, looks like a modern, I don't know, shopping mall. And 1860, 10 years later, got something that looks like it came from the Middle Ages. So people are always reacting in terms of style, whether it's fashion or music, even styles of decorating your home, in either going with new trends or kind of reacting against them. And that's what the arts and crafts movement was. Will Morris believed that we were losing something if we gave up handmade things made from traditional craftspeople's techniques. So middle is actually at the time that he was actively working as an arts and crafts designer, that house was new construction built by his design that looks like a house for a hobbit from Lord of the Rings, right? It looks like something from the Middle Ages, much more simple. He advocated for handmade things made in traditional craft techniques, but he also was a smart businessman. He organized his company, the William Morris Company, to produce arts and crafts style objects at a variety of price points. This chair on the right, handmade by a craftsman, but less expensive than some of the other furniture he designed. One of his higher end price point objects is this wall hung tapestry, hand woven tapestry, which would be a much higher price point luxury item. But all of these are preserving handmade, non-machine, non-factory made designs. There were artists who, along the same lines, really felt that modern art styles had gone too far and they wanted to go back to what they thought were the ideal art forms. They believed art up to Raphael, pre-Raphael, was good, and they called them the pre-Raphaelites, and they were associated with the arts and crafts movement. You can see they're trying to kind of remake the Renaissance. In America, the arts and crafts movement has its in the work of Gustav Stickley, who's a designer and publisher of a magazine called The Craftsman, and the furniture designs and interior of Frank Lloyd Wright. So things made of natural materials by hand, traditional crafts, was something that happened really in Europe and in America, late 1800s into the early 19s. By the time we hit the turn of the century, though, there's another style that starts to emerge that we call Art Nouveau, and its name really just means new art. But the Art Nouveau style really looks like it's based on observation of nature. This is just the covering for an entrance to the Paris subway, but it looks almost like it's grown naturally as a plant or a set of vines that is holding up the roof and holds up the sign. This type of design style flourished at the very early part of the 20th century. It was promoted in shops and in exhibitions in Paris. One of those styles that really emphasizes beauty and emphasizes stylishness. The Art Nouveau designs were very heavily influential on designs for the Lord of the Rings film franchise in designing the culture of the elves. So you can kind of see how this looks like nature turned into a building, or nature turned into a useful object like a dresser or a cabinet. There are Art Nouveau illustrators who also emphasize these gracious organic forms. These are illustrations by Aubrey Beardsley. And we've already seen a little bit of Art Nouveau glass in the section on crafts, LA, which is kind of odd when you think about a luxury craft item for the home. You don't think insects, but a lot of the Art Nouveau designers did things that showed nature and that were not only natural in their shape or their form, but also represented images of things from nature, including insects. They're really quite beautiful and quite elegant designs. These are more Gallet designs in glass. LA design that I thought you guys would like is this decanter for red wine that has a vampire bat on it. That's pretty clever. And these that look almost like they're natural forms. They're curves as opposed to geometric, straight, hard edges. But don't they look like they came from space? They're iridescent and shiny, pearlescent. That style of glass is very much popular in the Art Nouveau style. You can see it here, and you certainly see it in the of Louis Comfort Tiffany. Tiffany was the son of the founder of the Tiffany Jewelry Company, and he, instead of making jewelry, wanted to make his mark in making fine glass items. And he brought the Nouveau style back from Paris to America and started making glass with this very pearlescent, refracted quality. And that style of glass is known as Favrile. You do want to know that, F-A-V-R-I-L-E, Favrile glass. Tiffany. The best examples are these, the peacock vases that really have the iridescent quality of the peacock feathers themselves. I also love his designs for stained glass covered lamps, especially in the bases, which literally look like trees or natural forms growing out of the ground. So he's definitely an Art Nouveau designer. The Art Nouveau transitions to Art Deco around 1920s, and Deco still will reference natural forms to a degree, but it's a more heavily reliant on geometric shapes. And you start to see that here. Even the figures of human beings are getting a little more simplified, more cylindrical in the bodies. We're starting to get closer to geometric design. You can see that right here. This is one of the medals, front and back, of one of the prizes that was given at an exhibition in Paris that celebrated this kind of new design. So this was the International Exhibition of Decorative and Industrial Modern Art. And so if you won in a category, this is the medallion you would receive, which instead of being a circle is obviously an octagon, very geometric in its form. So I breezed past them quickly, but some Art Deco examples of architecture. You can see it here in clothing. Even though it's a little over the top, it's primarily symmetrical and very heavily geometric shapes. You certainly see that here in the Art Deco furniture designed by Paul Frankel. It is very geometric and boxy. And so his main category or style of his work that he became famous for was known as the skyscraper furniture. It really was meant to kind of mimic the appearance of buildings in a large city like Chicago or New York, where buildings are built up to a height, then they step back and go up and step back. So even though these are functional objects, they do kind of reference the modern world. You can see some Art Deco design style here in the Chrysler Building. It's meant to look like a rising or setting sun, but heavily geometricized. And certainly you can see it here in the Art Deco sculpture, one of my personal favorites. This one is a fairly simplified, kind of cylindrical, in the arms and legs, the limbs, image of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to human beings. But I thought you guys would really like this one. This piece of sculpture is actually part of the architecture. It's also the logo for a power company. If you look at it really closely, you can see what I mean by how geometricized the body is. Those are fingers, but they literally look like cylinders. Super symmetrical, super heavy emphasis on geometry, but so cool. That's Art Nouveau. You can see Art Deco in illustration, in architecture, in fashion. You can see it in fine art, in painting. This is Art Deco style painting by Tamara de Lempicka, whose design style really heavily influenced fashion in hair, makeup. You can even see that she became involved in advertising. This is a self-portrait of her driving a sports car, convertible sports car, that was used in the promotion of selling Bugatti sports vehicles. So you can really see this modern world coming to the forefront. We talked about the De Stijl style. De Stijl literally translates from the Dutch as the style, and the goal of it was to make a style that was independent of culture or historical aspect, that would emphasize simple things, lines and shapes, primary colors, black wool. You could make anything from those basic forms. It opened floor plans for the first time, and we really see an emphasis here on making a multi-purpose, multi-function space. That was very much at the heart of the De Stijl style. We saw it in Mondrian's painting that goes with this. And you can also see it in the Bauhaus. We talked about the Bauhaus as an architecture school, but they also very much believed that we needed to have as much attention to the design of the furniture and the clothing and the objects in the building as we do to the building itself. So we looked at some Bauhaus architecture, but I wanted to give you another example here of Bauhaus design for the interior in this very modern-looking chair by Marcel Breuer. So Breuer's the Bauhaus designer to keep your eye on. He definitely used contemporary materials, though. If you look at it, you might not recognize it in this form, but the size and weight of the tubing, the aluminum tubing that makes up that chair, is actually the exact same tubing used for making bicycle frames. So he's using an industrially available material, but for a different purpose. You can certainly see that the Bauhaus designers, as that international style proliferates throughout America, gave us some really modern-looking objects. These glass houses, generally they're guest houses. They're not meant as full-time permanent residences. They're usually on large estates. But it is a way of providing a very clean access visually between the interior and the exterior, and it's very much built off that Bauhaus design. Moving from Bauhaus now into the 1930s and into the 40s, we have the advent of streamlining. Streamlining came about because of experimentation in wind tunnels, trying to design cars and other vehicles that would have less resistance as they moved through the air. Obviously, something that's lower to the ground and has more curvature is going to flow through the air much more efficiently than something that's more boxy. So streamlining was necessary in design for vehicles. It doesn't necessarily make sense to apply that to something like a pitcher for pouring orange juice at breakfast, but you can see how streamlining began to find its way into objects for the home as well. You definitely can see that here. This is my favorite streamlined household object. It's a pencil sharpener, but it looks like a spaceship from the Jetsons. This type of design was very popular around the world, really the late 30s through the 1950s. In the 40s, we also saw an increase in interest in more organic shapes, less emphasis on geometric shapes, particularly with the designs of a pair of designers who worked together, Charles Eames and Eros Saarinen. And as a firm, they won a competition for furniture design that was held in 1940 at the Museum of Modern Art, and they were granted an exhibition of their work later in 1942. They are perhaps best known to you for this design. You may have had molded plywood chairs in high school, middle school, or elementary school. The newer ones, of course, have metal legs instead of wooden, but they stack one on top of the other. And this molded plywood was a cheap way of creating more organic shape in an affordable format, which was at the heart of what Eames and Saarinen's organic designs were all about. You can see some of the designs later in his career of Charles Eames. The chairs that he designed for airports, these are still in use in Chicago and in other large hub airports. You may, if you ever watched the Frasier TV show, or your parents did, he had an Eames chair that was kind of the butt of many jokes in that series as well. Saarinen, when he went off on his own, had a partnership at the beginning of their careers, and they each had their own solo design careers later. Saarinen designed a very iconic object associated more with the 60s or 70s, the pedestal or tulip furniture. One of the reasons he designed these chairs and tables was because he wanted to get rid of all those legs that support things at the corners. 4 legs on a chair or 4 legs on a table provides more places for you to trap your foot or to trip or catch your leg. So the idea of a single leg to support the chair was a kind of new and very much about organic shape. And we certainly saw in designs by Saarinen this use of organic shape in architecture as well. The Scandinavian design style that really becomes popular in the mid and second half of the 20th century is about simple affordable, and usually things that could be stacked to take up very little space. And these designers all come from Scandinavian countries, generally speaking, smaller countries where people live not in huge estates, but really in closer proximity to one another in smaller apartments, in smaller cities, because of the climate and because of the landscape of the Scandinavian countries themselves. Space is at a premium. So a lot of the architects and designers would start to make things that could be stacked or take up less space, that also emphasize the appearance of these objects with curvature and simple materials. They're really quite beautiful. Here you get a sense of the stacking furniture, the use of a three-legged chair instead of four. All of these objects really become pretty popular in the 60s and 70s, stackable molded plastic furniture or inflatable furniture. You can see some of these designs still in play in television series, in movies, in music videos. And the idea of making things beautiful but functional continued all the way through design of sound systems when we used to buy music on records, or in this case, CDs. We see it in the development of the design of telephones before we had cell phones. You can see it in the idea of trying to make space more functional. These designs are all about how we can use unused space as storage, how furniture can be configured or fold into itself. When we hit the 1980s, excess becomes kind of a topic. The need for a lot of color, a lot of texture comes back into design styles of the 80s. Things get a little bigger, a little more elaborate. We start to see things following trends. I thought you'd find this kind of interesting. This is a designer, George Soden, whose work looks so 80s in these designs here. These are designs from early 2000s. You wouldn't think necessarily that this would be designed by the same person. So designers are trends and changes in culture and in fashion. We certainly see that happening with car design, with design even for futuristic objects in the film industry. You can certainly see that happening even in designs for hotels and for bars. All of these kind of ideas of mixing and matching references from the past are very much at the heart of what makes your current postmodern styles really work. So this is a good example of someone who's an architect. We've already looked at Michael Graves' architecture. These designs for the home. The Alessi teapot was one of the most sought after mid-80s objects. It was really worth a lot of money. The early 90s, it was kind of a status symbol to have one, but he also does designs at very low, relatively speaking, low price points that are available at Target. All of the things on this screen are by the same designer who did this luxury item, also did these, and you can purchase them online or in your local Target store. Kind of interesting to see how we've changed technology design-wise, how computers went from really big to really small, how phones got, and then we decided we wanted bigger and bigger screens, so we're now on the upswing again in making our digital tech a little bit bigger. It's interesting to think about. I like to close out this by thinking a little bit about culture and style. So if you think about a style and how it fits into the history of a culture, think about America in the 50s after the Second World War. Some of the most horrific atrocities in the history of humanity had sparked and completed that war. And I think people needed to feel good again. People wanted to feel successful. Suddenly things got big and flashy, and there were things like fins on cars that we didn't really need. Things got really clean cut and optimistic, even in our television programs like Leave It to Beaver. And you can only carry that so far, I think. Eventually there's a backlash against that. Look at the Beatles at the beginning of their career and then toward the end as we move from the clean-cut sort of 50s-ish appearance to these sort of radical hip that they achieved later in their career. You can kind of think of style in music and fashion, in design, in architecture, and in art as always being not only trying to find the new thing that's exciting, but also reacting against what the previous generation did. I suppose, continues a bit of that sexual liberation of the 60s, but it really is a vastly different world when we hit the 1980s. It becomes much more plasticized and produced. Think about the difference in music from the 70s to the 80s. The 80s then gave us the grunge movement of the 90s, right? We went from super plastic overproduced to very acoustic underproduced. So you've lived through this time period where things have reacted in style and in appearance to the culture as it was, to the generation previous, that we might create art that reacts against or in opposition to what came before. You all have really very much lived in a period when we have fixed things. Now, we could certainly look at some of these as being less acceptable or more acceptable. In the very early 2000s, this tendency to use cultural appropriation in body piercing or tattooing was a little maybe more acceptable than it is for us now. People are certainly more woke about cultural sensitivity issues, but we can certainly see how ideas and trends in fashion and clothing have changed and how we've adapted things from various cultures into a more global culture. Perhaps we're at right now in the 2000s, as we head into the beginnings of the 2020s, when some issues that might have been barriers for people first have lessened. Perhaps we're seeing a more open society that's interested in cultural contributions from a multitude of different voices. We certainly are living in a period where you have a choice, I think, design-wise, of either making everything go together is a great design strategy, or intentionally mixing things that don't really make sense. The trend in car design where the front of the car looks like a sports car but the back looks like a traditional mom's station wagon is kind of a funny combination. Or super tight clothing with super baggy clothing. It's kind of a bizarre mix of two things that don't go together that we kind of like. So as you go forward thinking about the art in your daily life, look at it, look for it in architecture, look for it in clothing, look for it in music, and think about how things will change as you navigate through your life. You may see trends or visual ideas that you'll recognize coming back into from the past, and you certainly will see new combinations of things that might never have been put together before that might make something new and something